Okay, hi everyone. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the topic of AI and creativity, but we're going to do it in two parts. The first part, we're actually going to start with the story of AI and copyright, because I think that is a really important background to some of the conversations happening in AI and creativity. Okay, so let's get started. Generally speaking, this is the picture that I'm going to paint for you. We have a technology being developed that potentially has incredible use cases, but it's pushing against a lot of established conventions we have in the ownership of intellectual property. Or more simply, if you dedicate years of your life to producing something like music or a book or an idea that gets patented, usually we have copyright law so that you alone can earn an income from that for a certain amount of time afterwards. But AI is kind of disrupting this. So on the one hand, we have the usefulness of AI models and the social benefit we might have from being able to put all of this knowledge together into sort of a useful piece of technology that can be applied flexibly. But also, whoever develops the best products will probably make a lot of money from this. So that's kind of, to me, one side of the argument. The other side is the copyright laws we have that protect, for example, artists who own their images, or publishers who own their texts, corporations who own culture. You know, it's not just individuals. It would be Time Warner, Disney, it will be Sony, it will be huge corporations who own cultural works. It would also be people who own patents and so on. And it will be underneath this the economic incentive of copyright and patent laws, which we'll discuss in a moment. We're going to start with an example from one that maybe shows my age a little bit, which is this little piece of music that exists between these two songs. The first song is Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie from 1981. The second song is Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice. Now, I should point out that this bass line, I think in the Vanilla Ice version, it's one note different, but it's a strong feature in both songs. You might have heard it before. I'll just play it for a few seconds. Okay, so you might have heard that in tracks before. And this is really the first copyright dispute that was launched over this bass line. And the resolution of the dispute was essentially that Vanilla Ice was forced to pay a royalty licensing deal to Queen and David Bowie, basically saying that some of the profits from his very popular song should be paid to the authors of the track that used this bass line. Okay, I want to jump back, about 300 years before this, and I want to show you that this situation is actually quite new. So what we have here on the left-hand side is a Dutch landscape painting from the 17th century. What we have on the right-hand side is a Japanese woodblock print from the 19th century. Now, during the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a trade of limited trade between the Netherlands and Japan, which saw the introduction of pictures like this into Japan. And artists such as Hokusai took great influence from these works, especially in their use of composition and spatial techniques. For example, there's a technique called rapprochement, where the use of darkened objects in the foreground and lighter objects in the background, it's sort of similar to what we call today atmospheric perspective, was used to create a sense of deep space in Dutch landscape painting, was employed by this emergent landscape tradition here in ukiyo-e prints in Japan. What was interesting, if we go forward another 100 or so years, that influence goes back in the other direction. So works by artists such as Hiroshige and Hokusai then became very popular in Europe, as these works, along with other goods, were traded from Japan back to Europe. And we saw a new generation of artists, most famously the Impressionists, get very, very interested in this Japanese form of picture making. A form of picture making that was already heavily influenced from Dutch landscape painting. In this case, the influence is very clear. On the left, we have an image from Hiroshige, and on the right, we have a painting by Vincent van Gogh. The composition obviously is the same. Van Gogh is sort of doing his own version of this painting, but what we see in a lot of Impressionist painting is the use of really quite two-dimensional objects superimposed on top of each other to create a sense of space. What's interesting about that movement is that it shows that the circulation of ideas and cultural influence, it's never really sort of a simple, one person has an original idea and that idea belongs to that person. It's much more complex. Ideas travel around the world in people's back pockets. They travel on ships that are trading other products, and there might be a book or there might be a painting, and these things influence other people creating things in other parts of the world. In a way, this sort of cultural influence can help us trace back all sorts of connections that different people were having. The image I have here shows a different story. This is an image from the 14th century showing a university class in the 14th century where people are copying, doing manual copying of books by hand. On the right-hand side, we have a woodblock print that shows the invention of the printing press. Now, what I want to point out here is that this really is the moment when we start to think about creativity as something that belongs to the individual. I'll show you why. So, the Statute of Anne was the first law introduced in England that really said that the individual creative work, in this case a book written by an author, could generate profits specifically for the author for a certain amount of time, for the amount of time that they would have copyright. And why did this happen? Why did this happen in the 17th century? Before that, the ownership of cultural works was seen as a more collective phenomenon. We might have trade guilds who sort of share trade secrets together, and we would have texts and stories that might not really be owned by anyone. But we've got this picture here visually. We've got the printing press here, and then we've got the output of printed books in Europe from the 15th century to the 18th century. So basically, with the introduction of the printing press, we get this exponential increase in the output of printed books. So all of a sudden, we have the ability to mass produce a work of culture, and therefore it becomes relevant. Well, who wrote it? Who owns it? And if that book becomes incredibly popular, the time it took for that person to write the book is all of a sudden correlated to a large amount of value. So the Statute of Anne was one of the first laws in Europe to try to link that value to the work that was put in by the author. And of course, it's not just books that can be copied. Once we move into the 20th century, we go from the ability to record music to the ability to duplicate these recordings very, very easily, from phonographs to records to CDs, and then to digital files. With the invention of Napster, if anybody remembers what Napster was an early file sharing platform that really had no copyright and no money change hands. So it was sort of like a way for people to download and pirate music. It was before there was anything like the iTunes store. The iTunes store allowed you to buy these files. It had some tricky licensing things. Do you own your files forever, or do you only own them when they're inside your Apple account? If I buy a CD, I own the CD. But if I have an iTunes account, do I own those files? Then we move into streaming. And again, the revenue model changes. No longer do you have a library of files on your computer. Instead, you play things on demand, and then a portion of advertising revenues and so on from the platforms goes to the musicians. And so what we can see here is that the pattern of consuming works of culture, one work can be consumed by millions of people very, very quickly. And therefore, the way that people earn a living from this, the way that platforms earn a living, also changes very, very quickly. Okay, so with these changes, we from this perspective, we enter the world of copyright and AI training. And this makes the story even more complicated. So generative models, such as Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, are trained on very, very large data sets of images that are scraped from the internet, many of which might be copyrighted works made by various artists. And this is generating a problem. On the one hand, we have these incredibly useful tools that can generate images from text input, but on the other hand, we have artists who have probably spent many years of their lives, developing their skills, developing their practice, and they might find that their careers are threatened by the existence of these tools. But furthermore, if their work has been used to train the tools, do they deserve some compensation if the tool can create something very similar to their work? This is where it starts to get quite complicated. Another example outside images is text. So one of the probably more notorious or well-known data sets, even though it doesn't represent a large portion of what large language models are trained on, it's been quite controversial. It's the Books3 data set. And Books3 is basically a data set of a large number of books that were scraped online. I think it's something like 190,000 books. Some of them are already outside of copyright. You can see here 236 books with the author tag William Shakespeare, so they're probably not in copyright. 197 books by R.L. Stine. This is more recent, probably written in the 1980s, so it would be inside copyright. The issue here is that these works are being used without payment to the original authors. So does that represent a form of copyright infringement? So to make things even more complicated, there are plenty of lawsuits starting to arise looking at the use of this copyrighted material as training data. And because of that, companies are probably less likely to disclose publicly which data sets they used. Furthermore, because the training of AI models is one of the most intense areas of technological and economic competition right now, companies are also probably less likely to disclose what is in the data sets they've used in order to create the tools that we're starting to see in the marketplace. So we've got this dynamic emerging where we're getting sort of very, very useful tools being trained on data sets that may or may not contain copyrighted material, but does that mean that some sort of copyright infringement has happened? So there's quite a few lawsuits going on in this area, and they're being adjudicated as we speak. In this case, with lawsuits against Facebook's Meta and OpenAI, both of these AI companies are arguing that their models do not output material that is substantially similar to the inputted material, to the books and the artworks and so on. They're arguing that therefore what they're doing is called fair use, which is basically what we would do. If I read a book and I'm inspired by that book and I write my own book, I can argue that that's fair use. But this gets a little more complex. In these lawsuits, in the process of discovery, there's been a feature identified called memorization. This has come out in some of the writing for The Atlantic by a journalist named Alex Reisner. And Reisner reports that in certain models, it's been possible to reproduce entire chunks of text from the training data. And this would be a big copyright problem, right? I'm not being influenced by a text anymore, I'm recreating the text, which would be the same as reprinting your book without your permission, or just selling your music file without going through the record company and making a copy and selling it to someone else. This feature of memorization, or bug, depending on how you want to define it, is probably something that the AI companies don't want to happen, right? Technically, the AI does not have access to the data set. The AI is not referencing the data set as a search function. Instead, somewhere in the weights of the model, it's accidentally been able to reproduce chunks of the data set when prompted in the right way. So this is one issue where these lawsuits have run up against quite a significant problem. The same problem occurred in Anthropic's Claude. Somebody made a prompt that described this television show from the 1990s starring Will Smith, and they were able to get Claude to suggest or to recreate the lyrics of the theme song, which was a famous song at the time, as an output to a prompt, which it shouldn't be able to do. In a sense, much like the memorization of this article from the New York Times, Snowfall, they managed to get Claude to reproduce the lyrics of a copyrighted song, which is obviously a legal problem. On the dataset side, the ethical arguments are quite tricky. So, on the one hand, we have a tool that could be incredibly useful. No longer do you need to have skills in Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator or painting or drawing to make a useful image. You could use your ability with language to prompt that image. Sounds very useful. However, as I mentioned before, if those images are drawing directly from the skillful creation and the skillful study of many artists, do those artists deserve some form of compensation? And that's kind of the question. We can sort of see, a visual example of this on a slide like here. On the left-hand side, so none of these images are by Chile. What I have here on this image is I've just put in a style tag for the artist Egon Schiele, and we've got multiple images that are prompt outputs in the style of Egon Schiele. Egon Schiele was a very, very famous artist who died, a long time before any of these technologies existed. But the strange thing here is that much like an artist who wants to mimic Schiele might go and study the paintings and recreate things themselves, that's just become a lot easier, and that style can be sort of mimicked very quickly via the use of generative AI. And we can see the problem for artists and designers that if you work a really long time to develop your style, and that style is then really quickly and easily copied, then what's the economic incentive to spend all that time working as an artist, which is already a very difficult industry to go into, because it can be very risky whether you ever make a profit off of all the work you've done. So how do we get around this problem? What I've tried to show in this first half of the lecture so far is that copyright itself is something that only became relevant once we had the ability to reproduce works of culture on an industrial scale. Before that, it really wouldn't matter who wrote the book or who made the image, because we don't have any ability really to reproduce it in a relevant way. But as soon as we have something like the printing press or the camera or the printing press and the camera, and we can reproduce images of images, we obviously need the legal environment that has sort of accompanied that. So there are similar developments to try to compensate for this at the moment. There's the idea of Creative Commons licenses for data sets, where creators could sort of submit their work with a Creative Commons license. One of the problems with this, which I'll get to on the next slide, is that we're looking at the development of a technology that happens across different legal jurisdictions, and data could easily be transferred on the internet. So copyright laws might only be enforceable in one jurisdiction, in one country, or in one sort of legal collection of countries, and so therefore what is produced in one country could be used in another. So to come back to sort of the initial part of this lecture, where I think we're at an interesting position is AI as a technology is something that is often referred to as the next industrial revolution, the next sort of major technological development that could dramatically affect the shape of the global economy. Most famously, we have the competition between the United States of America and China for who can develop the most effective frontier models, or even artificial general intelligence. And in that competition, both countries would face a negative incentive to regulating the use of copyright laws to slow down that development, even though that lack of regulation might cross certain ethical boundaries. So the ethical boundaries, to me, that sort of we're looking at is that, on the one hand, AI models, very useful. They're part of a huge economic competition globally. There can be a big social benefit. Profits might be concentrated in small areas, which companies have the model. On the other side, we have the ownership of images, but not only the ownership of images, the incentive to work creatively. What the Statute of Anne was trying to solve back in the 18th century was, if you want to spend your life as a writer, well, then you should be able to own the books you've written, so that if those books ever become successful, all of that work you did, you can get paid back for. So this kind of, this tension we have in the development of AI has some very real problems and very real questions. And the courts that are adjudicating these matters are trying to do so, on the one hand, to solve some of these ethical problems, but on the other, to try to solve them in a context where their very own country, their very own legal jurisdiction, is also in a geopolitical race to develop this technology the fastest. So this, to me, is kind of why the copyright question is so interesting and so relevant. Now we're going to move across and look at how AI relates to the general question of creativity. Okay, welcome to the second part of the lecture. Here we're going to look more specifically at the question of AI and creativity. On the screen we have three images. On the left-hand side, a drawing by a child. In the middle, a series of streaming numbers. And on the right, a classic poster design for the film Solaris. And we'll see how these become relevant throughout the lecture. Okay, so what is creativity? What are we talking about here? Do we mean originality? Do we mean innovation? Creativity, we might think of individual artists, Pablo Picasso, Frida Kahlo, Jimi Hendrix. But we might also think of creativity as technological. AI itself could be an example of human creativity. Einstein's equations for general relativity could be seen as a creative solution to the question of space, time, and gravity. Our notions of creativity are also not that clear. If we go back to take the case of, or the example of medieval Europe, creativity wasn't necessarily seen as an individual thing. Let's take an example of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It's not really built by any one person. It's really an expression by a church, by multiple different trade guilds, by the passing down of various traditions between multiple generations and a large number of people to come together and to make something. And across the world, we'll find various different conceptions of what is creative and who is creative. One of the historical examples where we start to see creativity being really associated with the individual is Renaissance Italy. We start to think of characters like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo as being celebrated for their personal originality and their creativity and their unique vision. But creativity isn't just something to do with the individual and their inspiration. I think it's far more complex than that. If we look at an artist like Takashi Murakami, that this artwork is entitled Bake and Scream, we've got a lot of influences happening here. On the one hand, Murakami is blending traditional Japanese Nihonga painting with pop art and digital culture. But if we look at the title here, Bake and Scream, that's referring to a painting by the English-Irish artist Francis Bacon, who did a painting that was a copy of Velázquez, a Spanish painting of a pope, of Pope Innocent, and the Pope was screaming. So there's these multiple layers happening in this work that ostensibly comes from a Japanese artist, but it's got so many things going on, so many layers. And I think that is really a closer representation of what creativity is today. We live in a world where we're really connected to so many different cultures, so many different ideas, and so many different creative works that the works we create are kind of an expression of that. They've got multiple influences. So what I tried to describe at the beginning of the AI and copyright lecture was sort of how this comes about. The paintings that I gave as examples really are artifacts of international trade. They're artifacts of cultures sort of talking to each other, selling things between one another, going to war with one another, all sorts of exchanges where culture leaks from one group of people to another and is reinterpreted, and then it goes back again. We had these Dutch landscape paintings that entered into Japan, influenced Japanese ukiyo-e prints. Japanese ukiyo-e prints go back to Europe, influence the Impressionists, and on it goes. And then in the background, we had this starting to transition into the age of, we could call it recorded creativity. We've got, what was musical sampling before there was an ability to record music? I'm sure musicians would all, play each other's songs, or who wrote which song might be less relevant until you can record the music. And then we get the copyright law that was generated from books starting to apply to music. And we had this lawsuit that I described in the previous lecture. So many art historians and media theorists have come up with contemporary definitions of creativity that try to describe sort of how we work today. It's not so much a question of the individual genius getting their thoughts from nowhere. It's people working in this area where there's just so many influences coming in constantly that our work has what, in this case, Nicolas Bourriard describes, a sort of a sense of post-production. Bourriard gives the example of the DJ. If you think about a DJ on stage, a DJ isn't there with a whole bunch of musical instruments creating all the sounds themselves. They would have samples, they would have a drum machine, they would have all sorts of different pieces of music, and they're recombining them to make something new. And we can apply this logic to all sorts of different software we use today. The theorist Lev Manovich describes software like Photoshop or GarageBand or any creative software where you can import a file, change it, edit it, and then export the file, as really confirming this sort of post-production culture that Bourriard describes, where it's not necessarily a case of starting with a blank piece of paper and a pencil. It's starting with pieces of lots of different things and rearranging them and recombining them. And this brings up a tricky question. If rearranging things, remixing things, or recombining things is already sort of how we make creative works today, how is that different to an AI rearranging things and recombining things? What's the difference? Are AI works creative already because they're sort of making these remixes of things we already know? Well, there's some interesting answers to this question. One of the answers that I found really fascinating came from a lecture given by the music producer Alex Ebert. And Ebert talks about creativity as a form of innovation that's a little bit like evolution. He describes creative innovation as often finding something that you didn't know you were looking for until you found it and you realized it was the right thing. So what on earth is he talking about? I'll give you an example. Well, I'll give you Ebert's example. Ebert gives the example of distortion in electric guitar. If we go back to amplified music before the 1950s, 1960s, we don't have the distortion effect. We have sort of a cleaner amplification of electric guitar. But there's a sound that sounds kind of messy, that sounds kind of broken, but that sound really captured the imagination of people and has remained popular for 75 years, 3 generations of people. I'll play you the sound, and then I'll describe to you how it came about. Okay, so that sound, that kind of dirty, amplified, rough sound, comes from essentially damaging the speaker cone inside the guitar amplifier. And Alex Ebert gives the example of Dave Davies, the guitarist from the Kinks, who said that there were a few people doing this at the time, and Davies is just one example. And Davies said, he was very unhappy, he was creatively frustrated, and he was sitting around with a knife, and in a very, in artistic frustration, he was going to cut something. And instead of himself or something of equal importance, he cut his amplifier. And when he heard the sound, he said it was exactly what he was looking for. But what I want to sort of note here, and what Ebert points out is really interesting, is that That sound, at many other points in history, might have been an ugly sound. It might have been a mistake. It was basically a broken amplifier. But for some reason, at that time, it was recognized by the guitarist as the sound he was looking for. And it's a sound that we're very familiar with now as kind of the sound of rock and roll, the distorted guitar. So there's one definition of creativity, sort of the mistake that we didn't know that we were looking for, and only ourselves, the artist, can identify that, yes, that's the sound I wanted. I'll give you another tricky definition of creativity. Last year, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was actually won by some computer scientists from Google behind the DeepMind project. And what's interesting here, this is Demi Hasabi on the left and John Jumper on the right. Their protein-solving AI called AlphaFold was able to sort of unravel the physical mystery of protein structures, which are very useful for discovering new molecules for potential healthcare applications and so on. We could argue that, okay, so this AI, it's creative in maybe an instrumental way. It's solving a problem that we couldn't solve before. Does that mean it's being creative? I would definitely say that the creation of the tool by Hasabi, Jumper, and their team is creative. But is this tool, which can then create many, many, many different iterations of proteins, is that creative? And this is sort of where I think a lot of our conversations on AI and creativity get confused. If we go back to Ebert's argument about guitar distortion, what he was saying is that it wasn't just sort of random new combinations, random new remixes, or random new changes that define the significance of guitar distortion. He was saying it was the relationship between those new combinations and the human condition. Something about that sound, it was a random change, a broken amplifier, but it resonated with the musician and resonated with the audience. If we jump forwards, a decade later, Jimi Hendrix plays the American national anthem to a huge crowd at Woodstock, and the combination of that sound with the national anthem sort of characterized the changing values of a younger generation, changing values in terms of cultural values, geopolitical values. At that time, America's participation in the Vietnam War was very controversial, and there was sort of a generational split. And in a way, that sound crystallized the kind of emotional identification between that messed up sound and perhaps things that audience felt were messed up in their world. So back to Ebert's argument, it wasn't just the random broken sound, it was recognizing that sound, that's the one that we needed. And so what Ebert is sort of saying is that there's still a function where creativity is relevant or relative to the audience for who it's for. And this is kind of an argument that I think starts to get to the core of at least where we're at now with AI and creativity. On the right-hand side here, on the left-hand side, we have a pretty random image generated with DALL-E. A cow, a UFO on the a mountain plain with a texture that looks something like a painting. In this book here, Choreomata by Roberto Alonso Trillo and Marek Polix, Professor Trillo is one of the great thinkers on AI here at HKBU. They make an argument which says that instead of creativity in AI models, what we're really seeing is a performance of creativity or a performance of artificiality. Creativity where it might be closer to mimicking, much like a bird can copy human words but not know what the bird is saying. I think what Trillo and Polix are saying is that AI is sort of performing creativity back to us without necessarily having the sense of significance that we attach to these moments when something new is deemed important in the way that we sort of see here. Even the relationship between the musician and the audience here It's a shared agreement that this thing is important. And essentially what Trillo and Pollux are saying is that the difference between our human recognition of creative significance is radically different to the performance of us telling AI, this is what, creativity looks like, this is what an artwork looks like, this is what music sounds like, and then the system says, okay, I'll give you something that looks and sounds like that. Trillo and Pollux describe that as kind of performing creativity rather than being creativity itself. And I think we can simplify this a little bit by saying that our experience of creativity is very linked to our experience as humans. We could simplify it to say, we live, we learn, we teach, we die. In this image here, we see a child who is, learning what the world is, absorbing everything that's around them. And then we see someone who we guess might be their grandfather showing them. So the grandfather has gone through this process at a different time in a different generation and is passing on certain bits of knowledge that the child will decide, which is relevant, which is not relevant. And then the child will again live their own life, learn their own knowledge, and then decide what is relevant. Let's look at another example. On the left-hand side here, we have a poster for the film Solaris, which was made by the very well-known Polish designer Andrzej Brajant. And on the right-hand side, there's two images that I made by putting the synopsis of the film from Wikipedia into DALL-E, and I got these posters. Now, what I'd argue here is that these two posters here, they're okay, or I'd say they're okay but pretty bad. If I saw these posters walking down the street, they look like every movie poster ever made. They look terrible. To me, they would never grab our attention. What sets this design apart, I think, is not only its beautiful use of quite interesting fonts, but a quite sort of mysterious design, a design that doesn't just represent which actor is in the film, what are some key scenes. It gets at a sort of a level of abstraction that to me is a representation of good design. Another example here, same thing. We've got the Jacek Stoniowski's design for the poster for the film Taxi Driver, and then the same thing. I went on DALL-E and I put the description of the film Taxi Driver into DALL-E and I got these images. What I'm trying to describe here is it's not necessarily to say that AI tools will always make bad posters. It's more that one of the tricky things in creativity is that we're not making works for the consumption of machines, we're making works for ourselves, and so often it's only us that really know which one is better. And we could go down a philosophical path and say, here we're talking about taste. What is it that made that guitar amplifier sound correct? It's often very hard to describe. You just know it when you hear it, or you know it when you see it. This poster, it's sort of, there's a strange violence in this poster that grabs your eye. This poster here, again, I could walk past a wall of these posters and they look like every movie poster would be expected to look. But then it kind of gets interesting. So I'm going to go back to the argument of Alex Ebert here, and perhaps we can link to his full lecture on this subject, because I think it's really great. Ebert argues that, maybe this is the final part of creativity I'll talk about in this lecture, that every creative tool has something unique about it. And what's unique about AI is that we can make so many versions of the same thing until we almost no longer know what we're looking at. And he calls this semantic flooding. It's sort of like if you write down a word and you look at that word for too long, the word stops becoming familiar. It stops being meaningful and it starts to just look like a random combination of letters. And Ebert argues that perhaps that might be one of the interesting ways that we start to use AI, is not by kind of being lazy and just making a okay image and putting it out there. It's using that tool in the way that it is kind of unique, which is making so many versions of something until it becomes meaningless, and still looking for that output that has something that none of the other ones have. I'm going to finish up here with just a few thoughts from some well-known artists of their generation. This same argument is made by Brian Eno, a very well-known musician and music producer. Eno argues that every medium, at its limit, has something that kind of defines it. So digital video has that kind of digital glitch. 8-bit has a kind of a crappy 8-bit sound. Electric guitar could be defined by distortion. Blues singing could be defined by the crackling of the voice. The record could be described by the scratchiness of the record. Each medium has something about it that we recognize as what makes that medium fun to use. And so maybe what we'll be finding with AI is that maybe semantic flooding maybe that's what makes AI fun to use. By revealing how all of these outputs that by themselves have no meaning, by sort of flooding ourselves with the ability to answer the same question in 1,000 different ways, that might reveal kind of what makes AI as a creative tool interesting. The final part of this lecture is the question, well, is AI itself creative? Or is AI an artist? And I think what's really interesting about this question is that AI would not make images as an artist if it was making art. I assume that AI would make art that other AIs could understand, which we would only guess would be probably in code or probably numerical. Would we even recognize what is an artwork being made by an AI for the consumption of an AI? We make artworks that are relevant to our own bodies, to our own sense of vision, our own, the frequencies we can hear at. And AI does not share any of these perceptual systems that we have. So its form of art probably would be something we wouldn't even recognize. And for those who know this book, or perhaps the film, that's basically the plot of this film and this book, Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. This has been the heavily reliant on Polish references creativity lecture. The book by Stanislaw Lem, I thoroughly recommend it. It's basically about humanity confronting a form of creativity that is so much more powerful than they are that we can't even recognize it. A bunch of people in a spaceship fly to a planet that is a big ocean, and the ocean itself seems to be intelligent. And what's interesting is that much like our confrontation with the potential artificial general intelligence, the communication between the humans and that massive intelligence might be as difficult as our communication with any other species on this planet. It's very difficult for us to have a meaningful conversation with a bird, for example. So the final question in AI creativity to me is not whether the images are artistically good. That I would put in the question of semantic flooding. They're really images for us. If AI itself was to create artworks, how would we even know they're being created? So these are the two kind of areas that I want to leave you with, and I hope this lecture was interesting. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.